Thank you. Ah, well, we know who's going first because it's Hannah, because she's bottling out. You know, she's just refusing to ignore her child. You know, she's which all good parents should ignore their children. So Hannah, and then Orla, because you've got to get warm, and then Orla, and then Colin, then Sarah. Okay, Sarah's complaining. She wants to be earlier. No, you're all right. Oh, yeah. So Hannah, Orla, Colin, Sarah. Okay, we're ready to go. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, and assembled company, welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe and connecting the world by story. And tonight we have tales of wise women and crows. And to start us off, we are going down to the very tip of the Thames estuary. No, not Campy Island. That's where the rubbish dump is. We're going to Southend, land of my youth. We used to go down there. There used to be a wonderful roundabout with little aeroplanes at the end of the pier at Southend. Today's health and safety would be really, everyone would have nightmares because it went over the sea. So in your little aeroplane, as a sort of 5-year-old, I was flying over the sea. It was great, terrifying and great. But anyway, enough of that. Enough reminiscing. Let us go without further ado, and not too many more asides, because she has to get on. Can you put your hands together, please, and welcome Hannah Brosford.
Thank you, John. So the story I would like to tell you is both about a crone and a wise woman. And my story starts a long time ago, as all the best stories do. A long time ago, there was a village. And on the outskirts of this village, there was a wood. And on the outskirts of the wood, there was a tumble-down cottage. And in that cottage lived a woman who had lived there both as a child and as a young woman, and now in her dotage. And she asked for very little out of life. She lived off the land. She spent her days in the woods, collecting herbs and foraging. And she didn't spend very much time in the village. Now, the reason she didn't spend time in the village was because the village didn't wish her to be there. You see, she was an outsider. She was different from them. And over the years, they had decided that she was no ordinary woman. They didn't see her for what she was. They would call her crone, hag, witch. And if anything bad befell the village, then of course it was the witch in the tumble-down cottage's fault. She would very rarely go into the village, but when she did, if she needed to go to the market, she would have to dodge the stones that the children would throw at her. "Begone, witch! We don't want you in our village." And indeed, if the children weren't behaving, then the parents would use the threat of the witch at the corner of the woods, coming to visit them in their dreams, casting evil spells upon them. Now there was one house in the village where a mother and father lived, and they had tried for a very long time to have a child, And then the miracle happened, and they were given a child, gifted that most blessed thing. But unfortunately, when the child was 3, the child fell dangerously ill. And of course, they sought out the help of the village doctor. But the village doctor had no solution for them and simply said, "It is time for you to call the village priest, for I can do nothing for your child." But the mother refused to believe that there was no cure for her child. And whereas her husband said it was the witch that had put a curse upon him, she didn't come from that village and she didn't believe what the other villagers said. And so when her husband went out to work on the fields, she wrapped up her son and took him out of the village through the woods to the tumble town cottage. There she begged the woman, that crone, that hag, that witch that the villagers called her, and said, "Please, there must be something that you can do for my child." Hoping that at the very least, if she was a witch, she was a good witch that would take pity upon her. Well, of course, the woman took the mother and the child into her home, and she placed the child on her bed, and she went to work finding herbs and potions and all sorts of things that you can imagine in a tumble down cottage where a woman who wasn't accepted lived. And she made all of those things into a compress, and she placed that compress on that child's head. Mother sat with the woman, and that woman, she sang a soft tune to the child. And within the hour, the child's fever had broken. The mother was overjoyed and thanked the woman, and the woman said, "It is nothing. It is the least I can do for you. Here, take this and give this to your son for the next week, and he will be fine." And with that, the mother left with the child in her arms once more and a bottle in her pocket. She didn't ask what was in the bottle. She just had faith that the woman had given her something that would restore her child to full health. And of course she had. And within the week, the young child was fitter and stronger than ever. And as he grew fit and strong, and never another illness befell him. And when he was 13, another sickness fell upon that village, not upon the boy, but the sickness was caused by the drought, for it hadn't rained for 3 months. And of course, the villagers let out the cry again that the witch from the woods had cursed the clouds so that they wouldn't rain upon them. But the boy felt that it wasn't the witch's fault, for his mother had brought him up in those 10 years with the knowledge of what that woman had done for him. Of course, she'd kept it from her husband, for she knew he would be angry. Well, a meeting was convened of the village, and they decided that they needed to do something about this witch once and for all. If they didn't burn that witch away from their village, then surely they would all die from thirst. But the boy was horrified by this. And so, before the villagers could get to the witch, he set out on his own through the wood to warn her. But when he got to the tumble-down cottage, he found that the woman was herself sick. She hadn't drunk anything for days, and there she lay on her bed, dehydrated and weak. And so, knowing that she couldn't run, he decided that he would stop his village. Meanwhile, the men of the village had gathered together. They'd lit their torches and they were making their own way through the wood to the witch's house. But the son, he ran as fast as he could to stop them. Of course, when he met the crowd of angry men with their torches, they weren't going to listen to a boy. And his father was ashamed. Why are you defending that hag, that witch? Do you wish our village to die under her curse? Stand aside, boy, or I will make you stand aside. Well, the mother had found her son gone, and fearing for him, she too had gone into the woods. And the moment that the son and the father stood up to each other was the moment that she too arrived amongst the throng. Stop, she cried. Please, this has gone far enough. There is a truth you do not know. You would not have that young boy standing in front of you. That boy would never have got to 13 had it not been for the woman you call hag, the woman you call crone, the woman you call witch. She is no witch. She is a healer, and she saved our son. So put down your torches. But of course, the men looked to the father. But before the father could act, there was suddenly a rumble of thunder, and then the first drops of rain fell. And that rain quenched those fires. And the men turned back to rejoice with their wives and their families that finally the drought was broken. And from that day on, that woman who had been called crone, who'd been called hag, who'd been called witch, she was left alone, save for the mother and the son who regularly visited her, making sure that she was restored to health and that she wanted for nothing. And so the stories began to change. No longer was she a figure of nightmares, but instead the new story was of the wise woman who healed a child and quelled a drought.
Wonderful, wonderful, Hannah. Thank you. And I've got to congratulate you, Hannah. One of the problems with putting Hannah on first is that usually the first story takes 3/4 of an hour. She showed incredible self-discipline tonight. So I think a further round of applause for Hannah managing to have that self-discipline. Brilliant. Oh, sorry, Hannah. Couldn't resist it. So even when you behave, I take the rise out of you. I'm terribly sorry. Forgive me. Right now, there's actually it's great while I'm in isolation. She can't sort of drive up the A12 and give me a slap. So anyway, let's move across. I've got my magic carpet across the Emerald Isle now, and just fresh from the sea, like many mythical creatures that we talk of. Could we give a big round of applause for Orla McGovern?
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I think that the sea froze the story I was going to tell out of me because there's another one coming instead. But that's what happens. So here we go. The kingdom had suffered a very harsh year. There had been drought, there had been crop failures, and now there was great hunger in the people. And with great hunger, it needed a leader to take charge. But their king was cruel and he was selfish. And if anyone was to blame for hunger or famine, it was not him. But he knew that something had to be done. Somebody had to be blamed. So the next day, he walked out to his balcony and he sent out a decree that he was so proud of. He would get rid of the baggage, the people who were eating the food who didn't need to be eating the food. And so he decreed that all the old women who could no longer forage, nor dig, nor fish, would all be sent up to the side of the mountain, and let them be taken by the cold or let them be taken by the wild animals, for they did not deserve to eat the extra food that was there to feed the strong and there to feed the kings. And he knew that this decree would not be met with, shall we say, so much happiness in the village. So he added another bit, and that was that the youngest in each family must accompany the old women up the side of the mountain. And if they did not do this, they would also be killed. That way he hedged his bets. There would be more mouths to get rid of and more food for him. But of course, in the castle, he had a castle full of food and grain and mead and wine and beer, and he wasn't lacking. But as I said, he was selfish. Well, because of this decree, that's how young Michael found himself on a cold night on the path up the side of a mountain, hand in hand with his grandmother, his sightless grandmother, his only relative, leading her up to her death. Now, she hadn't objected, she hadn't said a word, but as he took her frail hand up the mountain, he noticed just a little tear coming down from her eye. "Grandmother," he said, "are you afraid of death?" "No, Michael," she smiled at him. "I'm not afraid of death, but my work here is not yet done." And young Michael, though he was only 10 years old, could feel this heart, this big, powerful heart in his chest swell with anger, with love, with sadness, all at once. And he took his hand, the hand of his grandmother, and he led her back down the mountain into the house, and he hid her in the cellar of the house. He couldn't sacrifice her. Now, the king knew he had to be seen to do something. He had to regain his power. He wanted to be liked. So he decided he would give a reward to the champion, and he would set them a task, and the reward would be a week's full of delicious food. How kind of him. But he also didn't want to give away his own food, so he knew he would have to set a task that was almost impossible. He said, "People, we have been foolish with our crops. We must sow different things. So bring me the seed of every plant in the kingdom, and tomorrow I will plant it." Sure, of course, how was every seed to be gathered in one night? Well, that evening, Michael went to his grandmother in the basement, and she smiled at him, and she said, "The answer, Michael, is in the hill." And she whispered in his ear. And that evening, he took the last scraps of food left in their kitchen, and he laid it out gently in a little circle around an anthill at the edge of the garden. And when he came back in the morning, the food was gone. His offering had been taken. And there beside it was a seed from every plant in the kingdom. And he marched up to the castle to claim his reward, and the king reluctantly thrust him a giant basket of food to feed a person for the week, or to feed a young child and an old woman for the week. But the king could smell the rebellion in the air, and he knew another gift, another task, another magnanimous gesture had to be made. And this time he offered a month's full of the finest food for any strong warrior who would go and kill the hag of the woods. Well, everyone knew this was impossible, for the hag of the woods would wail, "Ooh," Whenever an east wind blew, you would hear her deep in the woods, and anyone who went to forage or to hunt her never returned. Well, that evening, Michael went down to the basement to give his grandmother some of the last of the food, and she smiled and she told him that the answer was in the trees. And she whispered in his ear. And that night he set off into the deep, dark woods with a little axe and nothing else. And in his ear was the words that grandmother had told him: watch your feet. When you hear the sound of the old hag, watch your feet. And he began to hear her wailing, ooh. And he looked down at his feet and he was just about to take another step when didn't he see this giant crack in the rocks, covered up by bramble, but a deep, deep ravine, narrow and deep, and at the bottom of it he could see the bones where people had fallen to their death. Now he scrambled and he looked around and he grabbed a few branches and an old tree and he put them across, and he scrambled across deeper into the forest, his chest thumping towards the hag. And then he saw her in a clearing, the hag of the woods. She was two trees that had woven together, two trees that had been struck by lightning. And as the east wind came down from the mountain, it blew through the knots and the cracks in these two trees and howled. So he took his little hatchet and he chopped down the tree, and the witch started her silence. Of course, the next morning he went up to the king to collect his reward, and the king reluctantly pulled out a barrow full of food, enough to feed a warrior for a month, or enough to feed a young boy and an old woman. And he also knew that his task, his next task, must be the hardest of all, because he could smell rebellion in the people. The stakes were higher. He must give the biggest reward that anyone could imagine. He must offer a lifetime of food, all the food in the castle, to be given to anyone who would complete the next task. The next task, he said, you must go and defeat the great she-bear on the mountain. And everybody's face fell. For every spring she appeared, the giant she-bear on the mountain, 10 times the size of any other animal, and she cast her shadow down on the village. And if you tried to attack her, well, nobody returned. You could hear them scream from the mountain. Their hunting grounds on the other side were gone. Every spring she came and you couldn't go there. So that evening, Michael went down to the basement and his grandmother smiled at him again. And she told him the answer is in the rocks. And she handed him a shovel. And she told him to take the long path. And that evening he set out up to the mountains, his little heart beating in his chest, full of joy and full of fear, love for his grandmother pushing him forward. And he went around the long way, the far side of the mountain. Nobody would take this, it was too long. And as he walked around, he could see the edge of the ridge where the path had been blown away and pushed away by a river that had burst its banks. And he could see the bodies of people that had tried to climb and not seen the river, and the ledge where he would have walked had he gone up the regular path. And he walked up to the top. And he looked around, and there she was, standing on the top of the ridge, the she-bear, a giant rock that caught the spring sunset and cast a huge shadow down into the village. So he went around the back and he began to dig away at the earth at the back of this huge rock, and he nudged it and it fell down into the valley behind. He had defeated the she-bear. The next morning, he marched out of his house, This time he was followed by the whole village behind him, and he marched up to the gates of the castle. And the king was furious, and he stood trying to think desperately to find a way he could get out of giving him his reward. And then the crowds parted, and out stepped the grandmother. "The reward is hers, Your Majesty," he said. And the old woman spoke. "I have been alive for many years. I have watched the animals and seen their patterns and known their ways. I've been alive for many years, and I have gone into the forest from when the trees were small saplings till they grew old and were struck by lightning. And I know every crack because I have walked it. I have been alive for many years, and I have seen the rivers change their paths, and I've seen the rocks come and go, and I've seen the way the shadows fall." And the king looked at the angry crowd, and he knew he was beaten. And he stepped aside, and Michael, his grandmother, and the whole village went inside and filled their baskets full of food, for, like I said, there was plenty. Well, they didn't kill the king. But from that day forth, he learned how to use a shovel and use an axe and work for his food like anyone else. But from then on, that kingdom was ruled by a council of elders who were wise enough to listen to the old, to listen to the young, to listen to men, to listen to women, and to listen to the earth.
Oh, it's a beautiful story, Orla. Thank you.
Thank you. I kept getting like spam pop-ups. That's why I was clicking things. Sorry.
Ah, you're getting pop-ups.
I was summoning pop-ups with the story. Sorry about that.
Right. Well, I think we're going to stay on that side of the Irish Sea, but go north to the Antrim Coast Road, and if we're lucky, we'll find sitting on a rock up there. There's Colin Irwin, and he claims he's got a story for us, and I've never known Colin not to have a story for us, or a song, or a poem, or something. So, Colin, can you get off that rock and get towards a microphone or something, and give us a tale?
Okay.
Big round of applause for Colin Irwin, and another for Orla.
That was a great story, Orla. Love that. That's one for the White House today, isn't it? I'm coincidentally I've been working up a story, a wise woman story over the last couple of days, but it's just not ready for airing yet. So I'm gonna.
Can I just cut in for 2 seconds, Colin? I'm sorry. Because Rob's got to leave us soon, and Rob Cloney there is going to be our children's teller for Friday, and I just want to sort of announce that while he's with us, and give us a wave, Rob. And I'm terribly sorry to cut into you, Colin, there, but
no,
I have the floor again.
John, do you want Rob to tell a story before he goes, if he's got to go?
I have a class beginning in about 3 minutes, so I need to.
Okay.
I try to jump in. Listen.
I just wanted to announce his presence on Friday, so we'll see you then, Rob.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell one that I've told before on here, but it's one of my favourite wise women stories. I've got lots of little things that I kind of keep in a wee leather suitcase that remind me of lots of stories that I tell, and sometimes I use them and sometimes I don't. But anyway, in this story, I'm going to. It's called A Wise Woman of Balayam, which coincidentally is where Liz Weir lives, but it's not about Liz Weir. Once upon a time, people believed that a Stone Age axe found at the foot of Teve Bulla, the most striking, some say the most beautiful of the County Antrim hills, was a thunderbolt fallen to earth. It was said that these could only be found 9 days after the storm that delivered them. And these stones, fallen from heaven, were imbued with great power. And likewise, these little stones, arrow points, ploughed up by farmers, were said to be elf shot. The remains of fairy darts fired by spiteful fairies, and also charged with great power. And in the wrong hands, untold havoc could be wreaked by these powerful objects. But in the hands of a wise woman, Mana Fasa, women of knowledge, their potential for good and healing was almost limitless. You see, not so many years ago, people, the length and breadth of the country, believed in the knowledge, the skill, the good judgment of these wise women, or hen wives as they were sometimes known. They brought babies into the world. They saw corpses off into the next. They were consulted in delicate matters of intimacy, but as they say, Shinskilela, that's another story. Their wisdom was handed down through the generations, mother to daughter. Sometimes these wise women were revered. Most often they were revered. Sometimes they were feared. And occasionally, as we've heard in the last couple of stories, sometimes they were maligned as witches. And that very thing happened to the wise woman of Balayam. How she fell so low in the estimation of her neighbours after being held in such high esteem for so long was down to one man, the new parish priest. He had blown in from Belfast, and he had no time whatsoever for what he called satanic practices. They must cease forthwith, he said from the altar. Put your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Light a candle. Make an offering. And for all other temporal matters, of course, you can go to the doctor in the village. But these satanic rituals must cease. And although in their heart of hearts the people still believed in the ancient remedies, they were swayed against the wise woman. Overnight, she became an outcast. Far too easily, they disremembered her charm for words. The old copper coin laid on the growth, spoken words over them. The insistence of no payment and no word of thanks. They forgot about her ointments and poultices for everything from toothache to boils. They forgot about her infusions of wild herbs and tonics for everything from constipation to infertility. The rare and treasured thunderbolts passed down from mother to daughter through the generations and used to ease the pain of childbirth, among many other things, was suddenly of no value. The people believed the priest when he said it was just a piece of stone fashioned into a tool by the most ancient people of Ireland. The elf shots that were boiled with certain herbs and taken to stimulate the flow of breast milk were suddenly scorned. The priest said that these were just the tips of arrows fired by human hunters and lost many years before. These things, said the priest, as interesting as they are to the antiquarian, have no more magic or power than a pebble found on the beach. And so the people did put their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. They lit candles. They made offerings of halfpennies that they could ill afford. Their purses could not stretch to a doctor's fee. And so warts went uncured. Toothaches tormented people and kept him awake at night. There was no one to summon when there was difficulties with a cow and calf or a mare and foal. Children were taken by fevers, and babies were born still. The people began to despise the wise woman of Balayam. They said she was in cahoots with the other crowd, that she consorted with Old Nick himself. No one seemed to notice that despite all her supernatural connections, she was just as poor as they were. For all her evil powers, she had nothing to show. And yet they persecuted her. She was openly mocked and condemned as a witch. The priest demanded that she repent and mend her ungodly ways. She told him to go to hell. Late one night, the thatch of her cottage was set alight. She and her family fled into the darkness and never returned. Some said that they had emigrated to England or America. Some said that they saw her at the Lammas Fair in Ballycastle selling trinkets and cough bottles. Those who knew her best or who were related to her never spoke of her again for fear that they might bring trouble to their own doors. The story of the Glenballyman wise woman condemned as a witch and burned out of her home faded and was forgotten. Time passed, and 3 or maybe 4 generations later, a young woman returned to visit the wallsteads of her ancestral home. She could only imagine her great-great-grandmother making her remedies with herbs at her kitchen table. She walked round the wallsteads, long since fallen to ruin. And there she saw a byre beside the dwelling house that once housed animals. The roof had long ago fallen in and was replaced by corrugated iron. The young woman went in without fear as the swallows flew out over her head into the daylight. She felt along the tops of the walls in between the rafters, for it was whispered that the tools of her ancestors' trade were kept in the byre, they being too powerful a medicine to keep in the dwelling house. Decades of mortar dust and decayed thatch and spiders' webs did not deter her. Eventually, she found a ragged calico parcel. She unwrapped it, and inside she found the old cartwheel copper halfpenny, the charm for warts. She found the Stone Age axe, believed by her ancestor to be a thunderbolt fallen from the sky. And there were flint arrowheads turned up by a horse-drawn plough and said to be fairy darts. For the young woman, the magic of these things was not diminished in the harsh light of understanding. She took them home, and she keeps them with all her most treasured possessions. They're in a box by her bed, together with her diplomas and certificates that tell the world that she is a midwife.
Oh, Colin, amazing, wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to have to leave the island for a moment and pop down to Larne, get the boat over to Stranraer, come down over the border, cut across the A1 all the way down to the bottom of the A1, where the A1 intersects the M25, and go around just one junction. And then up into Colney. And there, if we're very lucky, sitting on a roundabout, you're just as you're going to turn off to Sainsbury's. We'll find Sarah Lloyd Winder.
Sitting there.
Pardon?
Sitting there with the ferns.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's lockdown. All the roundabouts have got overgrown, and now they turn. You know, they're like that hinterland on by the Berlin Wall. You know, where it all overgrown and has become a big nature reserve. So the M25 is now a big nature reserve. So we hope. Colin, that was wonderful. Right now, let's go over to Sarah. Big round of applause for Sarah Lloyd Winder. Whoa.
Hello and good evening from a strange part of South Mims, in amongst the herbs and spices somewhere. So I don't know if I have to move anything because I'm still in the corner of my picture. Am I alive?
No, you're okay.
I'm okay. So we are traveling from this country way across the sea to the tiny island of Guam. To an island long ago where a wise woman walked round angry. She was angry with the people, angry because they didn't listen to her, and they certainly weren't listening to the ancestors. And that was the role of the wise woman, to make the people listen to the ancestors. But they had forgotten the ancestors, the old people, and they've definitely forgotten her. So she was angry, and the anger was replicated in the leaves of the banana trees that rattled together because there'd been no rain. There'd been no rain for so long that the grass was dry and rolling. And the children's tummy was dry and hungry. But the people had forgotten to save. And the wise woman had told them to save. Don't eat everything. Leave something. Don't drink everything. Leave something. Don't fish the seas until there's nothing left. Leave something. Just like your ancestors told you. But they hadn't listened. So this time, when no rain came, the tummies cried as well. And the parents looked at their children, and finally they realized they should have listened. They hadn't listened, had they? Well, things were about to get much worse. For the evening, when the wise woman walked round and checked on all the children, suddenly one of the children shouted and pointed at the sea. Look, he said, look, there's a something. And he didn't know what to call it. It was so big. It was a fish. But half the fish was out of the water. It was something they didn't see. It was enormous. And its tail was flicking left and right and left and right and pushing it further and further towards the island. And then that giant fish took a giant bite out of the very rocks of the island, and the whole place shook. And the wise woman, who had wanted to say, watch out, began to feel fright like the people around her. And the children screamed and cried. And they looked at the giant fish that seemed to be now eating their island. They had little food left, little water left, and now something was coming to eat the very rocks and stones of their existence. Well, the men called a meeting, as they always did. They all rushed into the men's hut, small children climbing over the top of the big boys, and they started to discuss. And then the discussion became argument, and then the argument became shouting. But after a while, they all seemed to rush out, past the women, down towards the beach, with spears and nets. And they tried to get the net over that flicking tail. And the flicking tail flicked the nets away. And they threw the spears, and the spears seemed to bounce off those glinting back scales of the fish. And the women turned away because they couldn't bear to watch. And the wise woman handed out the grasses, and the women started to plait and weave, and plait and weave. And as they wove long strands of the grasses, they wound them round and made baskets, and the baskets got bigger and bigger. And then the men came back, and they shouted and they screamed, and they were angry at the fish. And the people with tight stomachs watched the fish swim out over the reef and disappear. Well, they had a scant meal, and the men went back to their hut to discuss what they would do the next morning. And the women went back to the plaiting and the weaving, and the singing and the talking and the telling of the stories, and the plaiting, and their fingers were moving, and they were plaiting and plaiting. In the morning, the men got up, invigorated. They would conquer that fish today. And they waited all day, and the fish came in, and it grabbed great big mouthfuls of rock, and the island shook. And then at the end of the day, the fish turned, flicking its tail, and out it went over the reef. And the men ran down and leapt in their boats, their white sails flickering, and their bigger, longer spears ready, and their stronger nets ready. And out they went with hope, following out over the reef and away. And the women sat, and they plaited, and they wove, and they prayed, and they sang, and they told stories as they wove and as they plaited the long strands, and then they wove it round. And then one of the children shouted, "They're back!" But this was not a triumphant army. This was a bedraggled group. Little boats beaten up, men caught, big nets broken, heads held down. And the wise woman went forward and said, "Can we help?" And the men laughed. Oh, that cheered them up. If we can't conquer that fish, then you certainly can't. But the wise woman looked at the men, shook her heads. And the women shook their heads. And after a scant meal, the wise woman took all the women to the very top of the hill, to the last spring that let out its little trickle going down the hill. And she sat all the women in a big circle, and they held hands. And she said to the women, "Are you ready to make a sacrifice?" And they looked at each other. A sacrifice? Yes, they said, a sacrifice. Will you sacrifice your hair? Now, to those women, their long dark hair was their crowning glory. hair that they combed, hair that they oiled, beautiful, beautiful, long, 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 dark locks. But would they sacrifice? Of course they would sacrifice anything. So the wise woman called each woman forwards, and she pulled the hair down, and she cut each woman's hair and put it on the pile. And each woman came forward and bent over, and the hair was cut and put on the pile. And each woman went back, and for the first time felt cold breeze across the back of their necks. And the pile of hair grew higher and higher and higher and higher. And the women looked at the hair and looked at the wise woman. And she nodded, and they knew what to do. And they picked up the hair, and they plaited the hair, and they plaited the hair, and they wove it, and they plaited it, and they wove it. And as they plaited and wove, they prayed and sang and talked and put magic into the hair until it made long, long, long strands. And this time they wove it into a net. All their sacrifice, all their love, all their power into a giant net. And the next morning, the women came down from the top of the mountain with that giant net, woven of their sacrifice, of their beautiful, beautiful hair. And they took that net and they waited for the fish. Now the men saw and they looked and they thought it was a bit odd. They thought, in fact, it was very odd. And they laughed and they sniggered. You see, men do laugh and snigger. We pretend they don't, but they do, and they chat, but that is another story. And they watched. But then slowly they realised what was happening. And they came to stand beside their women. And as that great big giant fish came in, all hands threw it over the fish. And with the magic woven into it by the women all night long, somehow it caught. And they pulled and they heaved and they heaved and they heaved. And the flick, flick, flicking tail could no longer flick because they heaved and they pulled it onto the land. And the men ran up with their spears and they jabbed and they stabbed and they hit that fish until it was dead. Oh, what a feast it would make. But the wise woman stood up and said, remember to save. And they cut one giant piece and they took it down to the coldest, coldest place in a cave. And they left that piece. They saved that piece. And oh, they feasted until every little small tummy was full. And somehow that made the world change. And at that point, the rain came down, thundering down. And they looked at the wise woman. And although they didn't say it aloud, in their eyes, they said sorry. And to their ancestors, they said sorry. And they remembered their hair, for all the women felt the cool breeze on the back of their necks. But the story does not stop there. For this is a story of long ago and far away. A story still told in the tiny island of Guam. But this summer, in another island, an island of Mauritius, a people sat and watched oil creep towards their beautiful, unique island. And that beautiful island has many, many different peoples and many problems. And one of the problems is their government isn't very good. And as that oil crept slowly in July, closer and closer, ready to destroy their island, the people had to work for themselves. they had to weave something themselves. And so they wove a boom of plastic bottles and wire and string and human hair that people went and sacrificed at hairdressers all over the island. And they wove it together to make a boom to protect the land. That happened in 2020 in July. And it links those two stories of wise people so amazingly. Thank you.
Wonderful, Sarah. Wonderful.
Is
I
that
think I'm gonna-
brilliant?
I love it. I love it. It just and bringing it right up to date.
Yeah.
I'm going to finish on a snippet, really. Like most of us, you know, we sort of root through secondhand bookshops looking for treasures, and I found in Suffolk. I found this lovely book called. It was printed about 1900. It was a pamphlet, really, called Silly Suffolk, and it had some great stuff in. You know, including sort of the more well-known Suffolk stories, Tom Tit Tot, as told by Mrs. Walters and so forth. But Tom Tit Tot in its sequel, The Gypsy Woman. But within this little pamphlet was a chapter called A Wise Woman of Olden Time. And it had just a tiny. This is just a snippet of the story of a man that was he was quite a rich man, and but he was being annoyed by a ghost. So they said, "Well, you need the wise woman." So the servant sent off, because the great thing about this pamphlet was that it kind of. That was all normalized, you know. It was kind of like it wouldn't have been very good for now, because it was kind of like anti-science. But there's so you need the wise woman. So now a wise woman came down. The guy turns around and said, "How can this ghost be laid?" And she said, "By fire and water. What you got to do is go down to a stream narrow enough for you to jump over. And you've got to jump over it holding a lighted candle behind you. And when you're leaping across the stream, drop the candle into the water." Well, apart from Colin and myself, obviously, some men have the capacity not to listen to the whole, you know, they listen to half the things we're told, and we don't pick up the essential bits. And so he got lit candle, water, stream, leap across the stream, drop the candle. He actually didn't hear that little bit, which was slightly essential: hold it behind you. So he leapt across the stream, candle in front. And as he was halfway across the stream, he dropped the candle into the water. And of course, the ghost was laid, and he didn't have any trouble with that ghost from that day on. But from the rest of his life, the poor man's hand was just twisted round as a claw. So, Colin, you know, I'm not suggesting either of us fail to listen at any point, but I think a little concentration might be in order when wise women are talking to us. Well, thank you for tonight. It's been brilliant. What next Monday I'm really excited about. I was watching The Box. There's been a brilliant series on enslavement, and suddenly popping up, it was Samuel Jackson was the sort of ran this thing, but popping up was Dr. Maureen James of the Fenland Museum. Well, I knew Maureen as a storyteller, So I thought that's handy. And she's talking a bit about Clarkson and Equiano and stuff. And so I thought, well, that'll make a program, won't it? East Anglia and abolition. Because there's a storyteller that knows all about this stuff, and they can go, and then we can reverse things, and we can talk about the black abolitionists first, rather than as an afterthought. But when we're talking about something on program usage, and of course there were black abolitionists, so we'll put that first in the program. So I got in touch with Maureen, and she told me, well, not just about Equiano, but about the Clarkson brothers, which was the other East Anglian abolitionists, and their connection with Sierra Leone as well. So I thought, well, that even makes a better program. So we've got East Anglia, abolitionists, and Sierra Leone. And then I thought, well, I'll get in touch with Yusuf Jallo, and then we can take the story. We'll take this historical bit and bring Yusuf in with the with how that links into contemporary Sierra Leone. And so I'm kind of excited about this program. So that's next Monday at the same time, and of course Sunday everyone is welcome to come in and tell a tale, and it doesn't matter how long it goes because Ali doesn't mind not going to bed, and we'll just carry on. We've got our worldwide story round, and that's every other Sunday, and the next one is on next Sunday on the 15th. So we'll see you all that. Well, hopefully, I mean, I know you're probably swimming in the sea, Ola, but the rest of us, or if you can drag yourself, even onto a rock, that'd be great.
Get an iPhone and I can do it underwater or something.
Oh, that's okay. So and if you're not zoomed out after Lizzie's bit on Saturday night, Colin, because I know you go down the barn every Saturday night. If you can bear to come on a Sunday as well, be great. Song, poem, story, whatever you like, and and everyone, Sarah, Teresa, who's got her own program coming up, probably the following Sunday. I think she's lets me look over. Yeah, on 22nd, Teresa's half the program. So meanwhile, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Hannah, in her absence. Thank you, Colin. Brilliant. And of course, if anyone's watching and wants to drop something in the hat, go to the site, drop it in the hat. It'll go to my hat. If I get enough in the next couple of days, I'll split it up between everybody. If it's 5p, I'll pocket it. Right. So in order to get this lots of money, you just shove loads in, loads. Meanwhile, thank you very much, and we'll see you some other time at the World Storytelling Cafe.
That's good. I'll be there.
Thank you, Ali.